So the third step, it is a determination of the suitable test statistics. Determination of suitable test statistics. So after determining after selecting the significant level, that is the second step, we'll be just doing the third step in the test of hypothesis, that is determination of the suitable test statistics. So you will be using the certain test such as a Z test, T test, chi-square test, or the F test, statistics test, in order to measure the actual value. So it is a mathematical formula which provides a measure of the evidence that the data provide in respect to the acceptance or the rejection of the null hypothesis. So it is a test statistics that is based upon the appropriate probability distribution. So based upon the values, based upon the variables, or based upon the type of variables that you have to undergo the statistical analysis, you will be deciding the test that you are using. So there are the different tests such as a Z test, T test, chi-square test, and F test, and still more tests are there, and we'll be choosing any test statistics method. And the fourth step is that we'll be just determining the critical value from the table. There is a table value is there in your logarithm table book, and that gives a critical value, and we'll be just compare the test statistic with that of the critical value. And after doing the computation, they check the sample result, then they compare the calculated value, that is a sample result, with that of the tabulated or the critical value. You will be just comparing your sample value with that of the tabulated value. And the final, it is a making the decision, that is the decision means either accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. If the computed value is more than the tabulated or the critical value, then it falls in the critical region. In that case, the reject the null hypothesis, otherwise you will be just accepting it. So the final step, it is the making the decision, and the decision is dependent upon the values that you are getting. Okay, if the value it is more than the tabulated value or the critical value, then it falls under the critical region, and you will be just rejecting the null hypothesis. So if you are getting the less value, then the null hypothesis will be accepted. Okay, so that is the decision making. And so once again we will just revise the steps. So the first step, it is stating the hypothesis, that is you have to state the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Then you will be choosing a significant level, which is most probably you will be selecting the 5% or the 1%. Then you will be doing the test statistic. You will be choosing a test depending upon the type of the variable. You will be choosing a test, and you will be doing the test statistic, and you will be getting the answer, and that value will be compared with that of the table value in a logarithm table. And if that value is more than the tabulated value, if the computed value is more than the tabulated value, then it falls in the critical region, and you will be just rejecting the null hypothesis. And if you are getting the value which is less, that means if your computed test statistic value is less, then it will be accepted. Okay, then so while undergoing this type of test statistics, you will be undergoing the type 1 and the type 2 errors. Okay, while testing the hypothesis, you will be undergoing the type 1 and the type 2 errors. The decision to accept or reject the null hypothesis is based upon the random sample, isn't it? You are just choosing only the certain samples and you are just calculating the values. And that means you are just randomly selecting the samples, and there arises a certain errors in that. And there are the four possible errors or the results that can occur. That is, the hypothesis is true but our test accepted. Then the hypothesis is false but our test rejected. Hypothesis is true but our test rejected. And the fourth one, the hypothesis is false but our test accepted. Okay, so in other way, if you say that accepting the null hypothesis when it is true and rejecting the null hypothesis when it is false, then rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true and accepting the null hypothesis when it is false. Okay, so obviously the first and the second one, that is accepting the null hypothesis when it is true, that is the correct, and rejecting the null hypothesis when it is false. So these two statements are the correct, and while the fourth and the fifth, that is rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true and accepting the null hypothesis when it is false, and these two statements will be of errors, and so there is always a chance for computing the two possible type of errors, that is a type 1 error and the type 2 error. So these two statements causes an error, that is a type 1 error and the type 2 error. The type 1 error is that the rejection of the null hypothesis when it is true. Rejection of null hypothesis when it is true. And the type 2 error, it is that accepting the null hypothesis when it is false. So that is a second error. So this is a pictorial representation of we can say that it's a flowchart showing the type of the test statistics that you have to choose. And I've said that there are the different factors which determines or which has to be taken into care while choosing the test statistics. For that, if SD is not for a population, then you can choose Z test. Okay, and if SD is not there, and then there are only the two groups to compare, and if there is only the two, or if there is more than the two, you can just go, if there is only the two, then you can go for a independent data type, and if it is there are the more than the two groups, then you can use ANOVA for the test statistics. Okay, so if it is an independent data, then you can go for the t-test, and if it is a null hypothesis rejection, then you can just go for a multiple comparison test. So these are all things that you will be studying when you go to your higher classes. You just understand that we have to choose the test statistic, the type of the test statistic, or the type of the test that you have to choose to undergo the test statistics depends upon the type of the variable or the relationship of variables. Okay, so once again I will just go through the procedure of the test statistic. The testing a hypothesis, the first step, it is that you have to state the hypothesis, that is you have to state a null hypothesis and you have to state a alternative hypothesis. Then you have to choose a significant level. The significant level will be of 5% or the 1%, and then you have to undergo a test statistics, and the selection of this various tests depend upon the type of the variable that you have to undergo study. Okay, that is whether it is an independent data, whether it is a dependent data, whether there are two groups, whether there are only one group, if there is only two group, or if there is more than the two group, or if there is multiple groups are present. So depending upon the number of groups present, depending upon the relationship between the variables in the group, you have to choose a type of the test which has to undergo in the test statistic. So you have to calculate the calculation you have to do, and for that the certain statistical tests are the Z test, t test, chi-square test, and F test statistics that can be used. And then you will be get a computed value, and you have to compare the computer value with that of the tabulated value. And if that value, if it is computed value, it is more than the tabulated value, then it falls under the critical region, and then the null hypothesis will be rejected. And if the computed value is less than that of the tabulated value, then you will be accepting the null hypothesis. Okay, so and while undergoing this type of hypothesis or testing the hypothesis, the two types of errors are taking place. There is a type 1 error and the type 2 error. And what is the type 1 error? It is rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true. So that is a type 1 error. And the type 2 error, it is accepting the null hypothesis when it is false. And why we are just considering into this type 1 and type 2 error? Because we are just randomly selecting the sample, isn't it? From a population, we are just randomly selecting the samples, and this can cause a certain error in the calculation of a population. When we calculate the mu, when we calculate the mean of a population mean, when the sample mean, it is a x bar, isn't it? X bar will be okay, so we are just calculating it. And when we are just taking this x bars, different x bars, we are just doing calculation in order to get the mu, that is a population mean, then it can cause some errors, isn't it? That errors, it is a type 1 and the type 2 error. Okay, so it is arises due to the random selection of the samples. So that's all in this video lecture. So this topic is very important. You just read thrice, more than 3 times. You just read your textbook, and then you just study. You have to study what is hypothesis or define hypothesis, which are the different type of hypothesis, then the procedure for testing hypothesis. So this is a sure 5-mark question. That's all in this video lecture. Thank you.